Well, thanks very much. Thanks for having us here, and thank you all so much for coming out. I got into LA last night. We did an event at lunch today, and so having been out and about in LA in the traffic, I'm quite appreciative of you all turning out to be with us tonight. We're going to tell you a little bit about why we wrote this book and how we think that it helps us understand where we are today as we're in the midst of this extraordinarily interesting presidential campaign and, of course, financial crisis, of which we're also happy to talk about that as well, and trying to think about sort of where we're going to be moving forward as a country after January 20th, 2009, with a new president. And what we hope this book will help people do is to put into context the kinds of issues that we're dealing with. Because we start this book on November 9th, 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, so almost 20 years ago, and argue that we really have to look back at those 2 decades in order to understand where we are today. It's a little unusual to be talking about 11/9. We've gotten used to talking about 9/11, and it's one of the reasons that we wrote this book. There's been a lot of discussion since September 11th about how 9/11 changed everything. And, of course, there's no question that in many fundamental ways 9/11 did change many things. Of course, for the families of the victims, 9/11 did change everything. And there are a lot of things here at home that have changed quite a bit. As I said, we both flew out here, and, we know how different the experience is flying than it was before 9/11. And, all the issues associated with civil liberties and sort of our domestic institutions for dealing with homeland security. So certainly a lot of things changed after 9/11. But the point of this book is to argue that many of the issues that we're dealing with today were already there before 9/11. People may have woken up to them on September 11th, but they were already there. So you look at particular countries that are in the news. North Korea, once again, in the news today. When North Korea is not in the news, Iran's in the news. Iraq's always there. Issues like proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, even, other big issues out there, like how we deal with the whole set of issues associated with globalization. All these kinds of things, they were already all there on 9/11. And in fact, our argument is that really they come to the fore after 11/9, after November 9th, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then the ensuing collapse of the Soviet Union. It's that end of the Cold War that gives rise to a lot of these problems as you start to see in the 1990s failed states and civil wars and ethnic conflicts, and you start to see the rise of Al-Qaeda and so on. And so we'd like to try to take people back to that earlier date, 11/9, which, of course, is not just the numerical mirror image of 9/11, but in so many other ways is the mirror image of 9/11, because it was a day of triumph, a day of great hope that the Cold War was over and that we would be on to something better. Now, when we look at sort of this, how we think about our recent history, there is this powerful notion out there that 9/11 changed everything, and a lot of that has come from the President of the United States, who has articulated a frame for how we think about these years, in large part to be able to justify the policies that have been pursued since September 11th. And if you look, for example, at his second inaugural address in 2005, here's how he framed our recent history. He said, first there came the shipwreck of communism. And then there came years of sabbatical, years of repose. And then there came the day of fire. And some conservative commentators have called the years between 1989 and 2001 the holiday from history. And, when you do that, what you're basically saying is we don't need to pay attention to those years. They weren't important, nothing happened, or they were squandered, or the Clinton administration wasn't doing anything. There are lots of things associated with thinking about that period as a holiday from history, or as years of sabbatical. And I'm an academic, so when somebody says years, the President of the United States says years of sabbatical, my ears perk up, because I mean, we live for years of sabbatical in academia, but it really doesn't have its place as we think about the past. So what we're going to try to do is talk first about some of the ideas about American foreign policy since 11/9, and then Derek's going to talk about the politics, because this book tries to weave both together. You know, sometimes there are books about foreign policy, and they're just about foreign policy. They're not about politics. And then you have books about politics, and usually those books are about either the Democrats or the Republicans. And we really try to tell the story of both the foreign policy ideas that developed after 11/9 and why they're relevant for today, and then also the politics and how Democrats and Republicans were shaped by the end of the Cold War, and how what occurred in the Cold War's aftermath is quite relevant for thinking about the presidential campaigns that we're seeing today. So if we look first at the ideas, you know, recently there was that Charles Gibson interview with Governor Palin, and he asked her the question about the Bush Doctrine. And, you know, she had her response, and the critics jumped all over it, saying she didn't understand what the Bush Doctrine was. And supporters said, well, there are lots of different Bush doctrines, so she had to get clarification as to which one Charles Gibson was referring to. And it really obscured a bigger question, which is, why do presidents have doctrines? Is that a good thing that you have a doctrine? You know, if there is a foreign policy debate Friday night, there will likely be a question. What's the Obama doctrine? What's the McCain doctrine? So what you want to think about is, well, what is this whole thing about presidential doctrines? And we try to tell the story in the post-Cold War about how people have thought about this, because you have this big break in American foreign policy history. For 40 years, American foreign policy had a clear purpose: containment of the Soviet Union. It was an easy idea to understand, right? One simple, single bumper sticker: containment. You knew what the big threat was: Soviet Union, threat of Soviet expansionism, and all of foreign policy could be geared around that notion of containment. And if you looked at the U.S. government and what people were working on, you know, if you were in the government and you were working on Latin America, or you were working on the Middle East, or you were working on trade issues, you were working on oceans, you know, resources in the oceans and so on, no matter what you were working on, you were involved in the U.S.-Soviet rivalry and the whole strategy of containment. And, you know, we had the Truman Doctrine and the Nixon Doctrine, the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan Doctrine. You had all those, but they were all within this strategy of containment. It was an easy thing to understand, first articulated by famous diplomat George Kennan in 1947. And really, even though there were huge debates about containment, and of course we had big debates during Vietnam, and there were debates in the 1980s over the application of containment to Central America, there was still largely a bipartisan consensus that that was what America should be about. And then you have 11/9. And containment now is no longer relevant because communism is collapsing. And there's no need to worry about that expansion of Soviet communism. So now the question is, well, now what's American foreign policy all about? What is the U.S. role in a world absent that single threat? And there was a huge effort to come up with the new containment, the new easy-to-understand phrase about the purpose of American foreign policy. Certainly in Washington, everyone inside and outside the government wanted to be the next George Kennan and come up with the new phrase that would make him or her famous. And if you look, for example, at the Clinton administration, in 1993, they had a big debate about a big new idea to put forward. And inside the government, that effort was known as the Kennan sweepstakes, because, it was who's going to come up. And so one of the speechwriters at the White House came up with the phrase democratic enlargement. Now, do you remember democratic enlargement? No. So you can see it didn't really stick as the phrase of the era. And there were all sorts of other phrases that came out during that time. There was the age of hope, and there was assertive multilateralism, and there was the third way, and there were all these things. And they didn't work. The reason they didn't work is because we don't live in the world that we lived in during the Cold War.